In the early years of the 18th century, a monumental conflict erupted across northern Europe that would forever change the balance of power on the continent. The Great Northern War, lasting from 1700 to 1721, pitted the ambitious Russian Tsar Peter I against the mighty Swedish Empire. This wasn't merely a clash of armies, but a struggle between two visions of Europe's future. Peter, later known as Peter the Great, dreamed of transforming Russia into a modern maritime power with access to warm water ports and direct trade routes to Western Europe. Standing in his way was Sweden, one of the most formidable military powers of the age, controlling vast territories around the Baltic Sea and commanding crucial trade routes that brought immense wealth to Stockholm. Since 1697, Peter had been openly expressing his burning desire to capture territory along the Baltic coastline, where he envisioned building great ports that would connect Russia to the prosperous nations of England and Holland. The Baltic Sea at that time lay firmly under Swedish control, and Sweden reaped enormous benefits from the countless maritime trade routes flowing through these waters. For centuries, Russia and Sweden had clashed over control of the Finnish coast, and after the death of Ivan IV in 1584, Sweden had seized large sections of Russian coastal territory, including the ancient city of Novgorod, which they only returned in 1616. This Swedish dominance cut Russia off from the sea entirely, and Peter understood perfectly well the devastating economic consequences his nation suffered as a result. Another incident that fueled Peter's determination occurred during his famous Grand Embassy when he visited the city of Riga in Latvia. Upon arrival, the Swedish governor rudely denied Peter's request to inspect the city's fortifications, a slight that deeply offended the Russian Tsar. Peter swore an oath that day that he would one day conquer Riga and make the Swedes pay for their disrespect. Meanwhile, Peter forged crucial alliances with other rulers who shared his animosity towards Sweden. In 1698, he met with Augustus, the Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, who requested Russian support should the Polish nobility turn against him. In return, Augustus promised to assist Peter in capturing Riga. Although this agreement was never formally written down, those who knew Peter understood that he took such promises with deadly seriousness. At the dawn of the 18th century, Sweden stood as a colossus among European nations, controlling Estonia, Scandinavia, Finland, and the Baltic Islands. Its king, Charles XII, had inherited this vast empire at the tender age of 15 when he was crowned in 1697. Despite his youth, Charles possessed a natural genius for military strategy and governance. The Swedish army could march virtually anywhere on the continent, making Sweden a kingmaker in matters of war and peace. The young monarch controlled not only territories but also the vital river trade routes along the Neva, Elbe, Oder, and Divina. During his reign, the Swedish Empire reached unprecedented heights, and though Russia would ultimately defeat Sweden in this great conflict, Charles would earn his place in history as one of the most remarkable military commanders of his age. The formation of the anti-Swedish coalition involved complex diplomatic maneuvering orchestrated by a passionate Livonian nobleman named Johann Patkul. Livonia, encompassing modern-day Estonia, had fallen under Swedish rule in 1660, and during the reign of Charles XI, the Swedish monarchy had systematically stripped the nobility of their power and privileges. Patkul, an intelligent but hot-tempered patriot, had boldly confronted the king about these injustices, and though his eloquent speech moved Charles, the monarch refused to change course. When Patkul sent an angry petition to Stockholm, Swedish authorities declared it an act of treason and sentenced him to death. He escaped his captors and spent 6 years wandering across Europe, dreaming of assembling a grand alliance to humble Sweden and restore dignity to his homeland. Patkul's diplomatic efforts bore fruit when he convinced both Augustus of Poland and Frederick IV of Denmark to join his cause. Denmark harbored deep resentment toward Sweden for lost territories and grew weary of Swedish troops threatening their borders. When Patkul and Augustus's representative, General George von Karlowitz, traveled to Moscow seeking Peter's participation, they arrived to find a Swedish embassy already waiting to meet the Tsar. The Swedes had come to renew existing peace treaties, as was customary when new monarchs ascended their thrones. Over several tense weeks, Peter masterfully played both sides, treating the Swedish diplomats with elaborate honors while secretly negotiating with Patkul and Augustus. He signed every document the Swedes presented and even penned a personal letter to Charles XII assuring him of Russia's peaceful intentions. Just days later, however, Peter signed a secret treaty with Augustus, committing Russia to war against Sweden no later than April of 1700. Peter made clear that Russia would not commence hostilities until securing peace with the Ottoman Empire, but he knew his soldiers desperately needed time to prepare for combat against a modern Western army. He issued decrees calling for freedmen to enlist, offering them 11 rubles annually plus a drink allowance, and ordered landowners to provide one serf for every 50 households they controlled, while monasteries had to contribute one recruit for every 25 households under their administration. Within months, Peter had assembled an impressive force of over 30,000 men organized into 35 regiments. Most of their commanding officers were foreign military experts. Peter personally supervised the outfitting of this new army in dark green coats, breeches, sturdy boots, and broad hats, and equipped them with modern bayonets and muskets. He drilled them relentlessly in Western military tactics, teaching them to march in disciplined columns and maintain steady firing lines under pressure. While Peter waited impatiently for the Ottoman peace treaty, his new allies grew restless and launched their attacks without him. Augustus led his troops in an invasion of Livonia, laying siege to Riga, during which General Karlovitz was killed in action. Meanwhile, Frederick IV and Danish forces besieged the town of Tunning. Peter felt both frustrated and betrayed by his allies' premature actions, but he continued his diplomatic charade, even dispatching another Russian embassy to Stockholm to reassure the Swedes of his peaceful intentions. He went so far as to promise he would seize Riga from Augustus if the Polish king somehow managed to capture it. Sweden accepted these assurances, and the Russian embassy departed on excellent terms. Finally, in August of 1700, after months of agonizing delay, Russia concluded its peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire, and Peter formally declared war on Sweden. The city of Narva, built by the Danes in the 13th century on the banks of the Narova River, stood protected by formidable fortifications and presented Peter's first major military objective. His allies attempted to dissuade him from attacking Narva, fearing Russian control of this strategic location. But Peter understood that capturing Narva would grant him the sea access and shipbuilding capabilities he desperately needed. The Russian army arrived in September and began their siege with assistance from Field Marshal Duke Charles Eugene de Croix and an engineer named Hummert, who had been sent by Augustus. However, it quickly became apparent that the Russian forces were woefully unprepared for siege warfare. They lacked sufficient manpower, their cannons proved inadequate against Narva's walls, and disheartening news arrived that Augustus had abandoned his own siege of Riga. The final blow came when the engineer Hummert defected to the Swedish side, taking his expertise with him. As winter approached, bringing bitter cold and disease to the Russian siege lines, Peter made the shocking decision to abandon his army and return to Moscow. Historians have debated his reasons ever since, some suggesting he believed he could be more useful organizing supplies and reinforcements from the capital, while others saw it as abandonment of his troops in their moment of greatest need. Whatever his motivations, Peter departed, leaving Duke de Croix in command of an increasingly demoralized army. Young Charles XII, demonstrating the tactical brilliance that would make him legendary, seized this opportunity brilliantly. With only 8,000 Swedish soldiers, he attacked the Russian force of nearly 30,000 men and achieved a stunning victory on November 20, 1700. The Russian army, hated by their men and leaderless without Peter, fell apart like sheep without a shepherd. More than 5,000 Russians perished in the battle, aided by a providential snowstorm that blew directly into the Russian soldiers' faces, blinding them as the Swedes charged. News of the catastrophic defeat reached Peter a short distance from Narva, and he immediately ordered the surviving troops to withdraw to Novgorod. Across Europe, Charles XII was hailed as a military genius, while Peter became an object of mockery and ridicule. Nearly a decade would pass before Russia could avenge this humiliation, but Peter refused to let defeat crush his spirit or derail his grand vision. If anything, the disaster at Narva strengthened his resolve and sharpened his determination. His greatest fear after the battle was that Charles would march directly on Moscow, but fortunately for Russia, the Swedish king turned his attention elsewhere. Peter immediately began rebuilding his shattered army, reorganizing the scattered regiments into a force of over 34,000 men. He strengthened fortifications throughout Russia, gathered new weapons wherever he could find them, even ordering church bells melted down to cast guns and cannons, and imposed new taxes to finance this massive military buildup. In 1701, Peter met with Augustus for intense negotiations that lasted 10 days. Both monarchs agreed to continue their war against Sweden despite the setback at Narva, pledging that neither would withdraw from the conflict without the other's consent. They divided their objectives strategically, with Poland focusing on Livonia and Estonia, while Russia would concentrate on Karelia and Ingria. Peter appointed the experienced nobleman Boris Sheremetev as the new commander-in-chief of the Russian army, entrusting him with restoring military honor. Charles XII, meanwhile, decided he could not fight both Russia and Poland simultaneously and turned his full attention toward defeating Augustus. This strategic decision gave Russia precious breathing room, and they began to enjoy a series of modest but encouraging victories. Their first success came with the defeat of the Swedish navy at Archangel near the White Sea, a triumph that lifted Russian morale considerably. In January 1702, Russia achieved its first major land victory at Arestfur in eastern Livonia, where approximately 3,000 Swedish soldiers were killed in fierce combat. Moscow celebrated this triumph with elaborate banquets and spectacular fireworks that lit up the winter sky. In July 1702, Sheremetev led his forces against Swedish Colonel Walmer Anton von Schlippenbach at Hummelshof in Livonia, where the Swedish troops were almost completely annihilated. With Livonia now virtually defenseless, Sheremetev and his men swept through the region, capturing town after town with minimal resistance. Peter, emboldened by these successes, began considering naval operations and ordered the construction of numerous small boats designed to outnumber and overwhelm larger Swedish warships. He established shipyards on Lake Ladoga, where Swedish galleys and brigantines were already stationed. On June 20, 1702, 400 Russian soldiers in these new vessels advanced against the Swedish fleet, forcing them to retreat. Another assault on September 7 drove the Swedes completely from Lake Ladoga, and similar tactics succeeded on Lake Peipus. Noteberg Fortress, originally constructed by the people of Novgorod in the 13th century and captured by Sweden in 1611, controlled crucial trade routes throughout the Baltic, Lake Ladoga, and deep into Russia. Reclaiming this strategic stronghold became a top priority for Peter. The Russian army advanced on the fortress and subjected it to 10 days of relentless mortar bombardment until the defenders finally surrendered. This marked Russia's first major fortress conquest, and Peter was absolutely overjoyed. The victory was celebrated with a grand triumphal entrance into Moscow complete with elaborate arches erected for the occasion. The Russians renamed the fortress Schlüsselburg, meaning key fortress, symbolizing that they had found the key to unlocking their Baltic ambitions. Later that year, Narva itself finally fell into Russian hands, though it would be years before Peter felt the humiliation of 1700 was fully avenged. In 1703, Peter decided the moment had arrived to establish a permanent Russian presence along the Baltic coastline. 20,000 soldiers marched toward the sea, with Peter following in a flotilla of 60 boats gliding along rivers and waterways. They reached a small Swedish settlement and captured it swiftly within a single day. Shortly afterward, word spread through the Russian camp that a Swedish fleet was approaching to reclaim the lost territory. When the Swedish ships arrived, the Russians cleverly responded to their signal guns, making the Swedes believe the settlement was still in friendly hands. Russian forces concealed themselves in the marshes along the Neva River and waited patiently to spring their ambush. This victory proved absolutely monumental for Peter, as it secured Russian access to the Baltic Sea and control of territory along the entire length of the Neva River, achieving his primary war objective. The strategic region of Ingria was returned to Russian control. This triumph allowed Peter to fulfill his greatest dream by founding the magnificent city of St. Petersburg, which would become Russia's window to Europe. The Swedes attempted to attack this new city multiple times over subsequent years, but failed in every attempt to reclaim what they had lost. In 1704, Peter instructed Sheremetev to capture the fortress town of Dorpat in modern-day Estonia. This city had been destroyed centuries earlier by Ivan the Terrible, but had since been rebuilt into a formidable stronghold. The Russians faced a daunting challenge, but Peter arrived personally on July 3 and reorganized his forces with characteristic energy. 10 days later, Dorpat had fallen to Russian arms. With this success secured, Russia's attention turned once again to Narva, where preparations for another assault were already well underway. This time there would be no humiliating retreat, no desperate winter siege. On July 30th, Russian artillery began a systematic 10-day bombardment of Narva's fortifications. On August 9th, Russian troops stormed into the city, their blood running hot with battle fury. Still consumed by combat rage, they began indiscriminately slaughtering men, women, and even children. Peter, horrified by this senseless brutality, immediately called for a ceasefire and personally executed Russian soldiers who disobeyed his orders. Despite the terrible bloodshed, this victory tasted especially sweet for Peter, as it finally erased the bitter memory of Russia's humiliation at Narva 4 years earlier. The Battle of Poltava in 1709, fought in modern-day Ukraine, would prove the decisive engagement of the entire Great Northern War. Charles XII, still confident in his military genius, believed he could crush Russia once and for all, while Peter was finally ready to demonstrate that Russia had become a true European military power. Charles had decided to capture the small town of Poltava on the banks of the Vorskla River, after hearing rumors that 5,000 Russian soldiers were garrisoned there, with abundant supplies that his increasingly desperate army needed badly. In May of 1709, Charles began a siege that his own generals adamantly opposed, knowing the Swedish army was no longer the powerful force it had once been. Meanwhile, Russian forces took up positions across from Poltava and awaited Peter's arrival. Unlike previous battles, Peter assumed full personal command of this engagement, demonstrating how far he had evolved as a military leader since the dark days of Narva. After learning that Swedish forces were running desperately low on gunpowder, Peter decided the time had come to cross the Vorskla River and engage the enemy. On June 27, the Swedes launched their attack, but Russia's superior numbers and improved training quickly thwarted their advance. The two armies then met in an open field for the final confrontation. Peter rode among his soldiers in the thick of battle, displaying tremendous personal courage that inspired his men to fight with extraordinary determination. Charles XII, though seriously wounded and carried on a stretcher, continued shouting encouragement to his troops, proving his legendary bravery even in defeat. Within a few hours, the battle was over, with the Russians achieving an overwhelming victory. The surviving remnants of the Swedish army were captured, marking the end of the once brave and mighty force that had dominated northern Europe for generations. Charles barely escaped with his life, fleeing to Ottoman territory where he would spend years in exile. From 1718 to 1721, exhausting attempts at negotiating peace between Russia and Sweden dragged on, with complications arising at the end of 1718, when Charles XII died under mysterious circumstances during a siege in Norway. The year 1719 saw Russian attacks on the Swedish coast, with the new Swedish queen, Ulrika Eleonora, stubbornly turning down Russia's initial peace terms. George I of Great Britain pursued an anti-Russian policy, attempting to force Russia to return all conquered territories to Sweden. After prolonged diplomatic maneuvering involving not just Russia and Sweden but also Britain, Prussia, and other powers, the Treaty of Nystedt was finally signed on August 30, 1721. Under its terms, Russia agreed to withdraw from Finland, pay Sweden a substantial sum of money for Livonia, grant the Swedes the right to purchase duty-free grain in specific Russian regions, and release all Swedish prisoners of war. In return, Sweden formally ceded Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, and the Vyborg district to Russia, acknowledging Russian dominance of the eastern Baltic. On October 22, 1721, the Holy Synod and the Senate formally requested that Peter accept the titles of Russian Emperor and Peter the Great. After considerable hesitation and deep reflection on the enormous responsibility these titles represented, Peter finally accepted both honors. To celebrate his magnificent triumph, Peter pardoned all prisoners throughout Russia except for convicted murderers, demonstrating the magnanimity expected of a great emperor. The celebrations were extraordinary, featuring multiple elaborate parties, sumptuous banquets, and masked balls that continued through October 1721 and January 1722. The conclusion of the Great Northern War ushered in a new golden age for Russia and definitively proved that Peter had earned his place in history as Peter the Great. He had transformed Russia from a backward, landlocked nation into a modern European empire with a powerful navy, access to crucial seaports, and a new magnificent capital that would become one of the world's great cities. The price had been staggering in blood and treasure, with 21 years of brutal warfare, but Russia emerged as one of Europe's dominant powers, a position it would hold for centuries to come. Enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. See you in the next one.